Why did the room go quiet the moment she dropped her coffee? It wasn't the sound that stopped the laughter. It was the way she froze afterward, hands hovering in the air, eyes wide, as if she'd already apologized 100 times in her head before anyone had spoken. Plastic trays lay scattered at her feet. Coffee bled across the concrete floor like a small, embarrassing wound. No one rushed to help her. They just stared. Sarah Vance bent down slowly, cheeks burning, aware of every pair of eyes drilling into her back. She could feel the judgment before she heard it, the silent agreement forming between men who had lived too long in places like this to tolerate softness. Forward operating base heating wasn't built for visitors. It was a scar cut into a hostile valley, all sandbags and concrete barriers, smelling of fuel, dust, and fatigue. And Sarah didn't belong in any of it. She knew that the second she stepped off the helicopter that morning. The rotors hadn't even slowed before the heat hit her, dry, suffocating, carrying the metallic scent of war. She clutched the strap of her purse like it might anchor her to something familiar. Around her, rangers moved with purpose, faces hard, rifles slung like extensions of their bodies. No hesitation, no wasted motion. And then there was her. A sundress, light fabric, floral pattern, the wrong choice in every possible way. Someone laughed when she tripped over a duffel bag on the tarmac. A sharp, careless sound. "Better keep a leash on her, Vance," the platoon sergeant had said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "This isn't a daycare." The men around him snickered. Sarah hadn't looked up. She never did when things like that happened. She learned long ago that silence was easier than explaining yourself to people who had already decided who you were. She told herself she was only here for Mike. Her husband, Sergeant Mike Vance, the man who looked both proud and deeply uncomfortable standing beside her now, torn between wanting to shield her and wanting to pretend she wasn't drawing attention. This visit had taken months of approvals, strings pulled, favors owed, a rare, compassionate exception, and Sarah had almost said no. Almost. But distance does strange things to love. It stretches it thin, fills the quiet with imagined dangers. She needed to see him alive, needed proof that the man who kissed her goodbye at the airport still existed somewhere beneath the dust and armor. So she'd come. And now she stood in the mess hall, surrounded by men who saw her as a problem waiting to happen. "Useless," someone muttered. She felt the word land like a weight. Sarah gathered the trays, her fingers shaking despite her effort to steady them. She hated that part, the trembling. It betrayed her, made the assumptions feel earned. Mike met her eyes briefly. There was apology there and something worse. Shame. That hurt more than the laughter. She carried the trays away, her steps careful, controlled. Inside, she folded in on herself, shrinking into a version of who she'd learned to be over the years. The safe version, the quiet one, the woman who smiled gently and asked nothing of anyone. No one here knew her. They knew a silhouette, a story they'd written the moment she arrived. What they didn't know, what she hadn't told Mike or anyone else, was that she'd grown up far from cities and cafes and soft conversations. Grown up where silence wasn't awkward, it was necessary, where missing a detail meant going hungry, where patience was survival. Her father had believed in listening more than speaking, in watching before acting, in knowing when to wait. He taught her how to breathe through fear until it stopped owning her. But that life had felt like another person's memory now, something she'd packed away when she moved east, when she chose warmth over vigilance, love over solitude. She thought she'd left that part of herself behind. War has a way of digging things back up. The mortar didn't announce itself. It never does. One moment the mess hall was filled with the dull rhythm of routine, boots scraping, cutlery clinking, half-finished conversations drifting through stale air. The next, the world collapsed inward. A violent flash, A concussive roar. The floor jumped beneath her feet. Sarah didn't remember falling, only the sudden sensation of being on the ground, ears ringing, lungs burning as dust swallowed the room. Alarms screamed to life, sharp and relentless, cutting through the chaos like knives. Men shouted, chairs overturned, trays exploded into fragments. Gunfire followed almost immediately. This was different, closer. Bullets tore through plywood walls, splintering them like dry twigs. Someone screamed in pain. Someone else shouted for a medic. Sarah crawled blindly, heart slamming against her ribs, until she found the shadow beneath an overturned table. She curled into herself, clutching her purse against her chest like it might stop a bullet. She was crying, she couldn't remember starting. The floor shook again. Over the sirens, a radio screamed about a breach, northern perimeter, inside the wire. Inside. The words echoed in her head, hollow and unreal. She thought of Mike. She twisted, searching for him through the smoke. Shapes moved fast, shadows, flashes of muzzle fire. She heard his voice hoarse, commanding somewhere to her left. "Stay down," he yelled when he saw her. "Don't move, no matter what happens." She nodded, even though he probably couldn't see her. Under the table, time warped. Each second stretched thin, brittle. She felt small, exposed, a liability just like they'd said. The front doors blew inward. Two figures rushed through the smoke, rifles spitting fire. Rangers responded instantly, controlled bursts dropping them before they reached the center of the room. But the damage was done. The breach was open. And then she heard it. A single, heavier crack, different from the rest. A man screamed. Sarah flinched as something heavy clattered across the floor near her. She risked a glance. A rifle. Long, black, cold. Its owner lay several feet away, clutching his shoulder, blood soaking into his uniform. Someone shouted his name. Davis, the marksman. "No eyes on the ridge," someone yelled. "We're pinned." Fear shifted in the room, thickened, changed shape. Sarah stared at the rifle without understanding why her gaze wouldn't leave it. Her breath came fast, shallow. She felt the old instincts stir faintly, like something stretching after a long sleep. She pushed it down. This wasn't her place. She was just visiting. Just a wife. Just a woman in a dress who didn't belong here. But as the gunfire intensified and the walls around them seemed to shrink, a quiet thought surfaced, uninvited and terrifying. What if belonging was something you proved, not something you were given? The thought lingered, waiting. And somewhere beyond the smoke and sirens, something inside her began to wake. What happens when the thing you buried to survive is the only thing that can save everyone else? Sarah didn't know when the noise faded, only that it did. Not all of it, not the gunfire or the alarms. Those were still there, chewing at the edges of the mess hall, but inside her something went quiet. The shaking stopped first, then the crying. Her breath slowed, each inhale measured, deliberate, like she was counting down from something she hadn't named yet. She stared at the rifle again. It lay on the floor between scattered shell casings and a trail of blood, abandoned like a question no one wanted to answer. The marksman was being dragged away now, his pain loud and human, his rifle suddenly orphaned. Around her, the Rangers were fighting the room, windows, doors, angles, doing what they'd trained to do. There was no space left for doubt, no time for debate. And still, no one was watching the ridge. Sarah felt the pressure of that absence like a physical weight. She didn't know how she knew, she just did. The ridge was wrong, too quiet, too dominant, a place that punished hesitation. Her heart kicked harder, then steadied. She thought of her father's voice, not loud, never urgent, calm even when the world was. He used to say that panic was just unused information. That fear didn't mean stop, it meant listen. She listened now. The rhythm of the gunfire, the cadence of shouts, the way bullets snapped differently when they came from above. She smelled cordite and dust and something coppery that reminded her of field dressing a deer at dawn. She tasted grit between her teeth. She was back there for a moment, in the mountains, cold air, a stillness so complete it felt sacred. Then a round slammed into the wall inches above her head, showering splinters down her neck. Sarah flinched just once. Someone screamed that they were being flanked. Another voice cracked, edged with panic. "We can't hold this." She looked toward Mike. He was crouched near the far wall, blood running down from a cut on his forehead, barking orders into a radio that spat only static. He looked exhausted, older than she remembered, smaller somehow, pressed under the weight of keeping everyone alive. She felt something tighten in her chest. This was the part she'd never told him about, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't trust herself. She worked so hard to be gentle, to be normal, to let the sharp parts of her dull with time and city life and love. She'd been proud of that softness. But softness, she realized, wasn't the same thing as weakness. The rifle was still there. Sarah slid out from under the table before she could think better of it. Her movements were smooth, economical, as if her body remembered the choreography even if her mind hesitated. Her dress caught briefly on a jagged edge of wood. She tore free without looking back. "Hey," someone shouted, "get down." Sergeant Miller saw her then, his face twisted not with fear but fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared. "Put that down." She didn't answer. She knelt beside the rifle, fingers closing around the grip. It was heavier than the ones she'd grown up with, but familiar in a deeper way. Weight was just information. Balance. She pulled it into her shoulder, felt the stock settle against her collarbone, cheek pressing naturally into place. The world narrowed. The scope framed the ridge like a window into another reality. Heat shimmered in the distance. Dust drifted lazily across the valley. And there, movement, a flicker of metal, a muzzle flash she felt more than saw. Her breath slowed. She didn't hear Miller shouting anymore. Didn't hear Mike calling her name. The rifle was an extension of her pulse, her vision, her intent. She adjusted slightly, compensating for wind she read from the way smoke bent and dust curled. She squeezed. The rifle cracked, a clean, deliberate sound that cut through the chaos like punctuation. The figure on the ridge collapsed before the echo faded. For a fraction of a second, no one noticed. Then the heavy machine gun went silent. The change was immediate, like a held breath finally released. Rangers risked glances through windows they hadn't dared approach seconds before. Someone laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. Miller stared at the ridge, then back at Sarah. His mouth opened, closed. "Luck," he muttered. "That was luck." Sarah worked the bolt. She didn't look up. Another figure scrambled to take the fallen gunner's place. She fired again. And again. Each shot was spaced, intentional. She wasn't rushing. Rushing was how you missed. She tracked targets the way she'd been taught, patiently, decisively, ending threats before they fully formed. The room had gone strangely quiet behind her. The Rangers weren't firing as much now. They were watching. Watching her. The woman they'd mocked, the visitor, the problem. Mike slid in beside her, eyes wide, disbelief etched across his blood-streaked face. "Sarah," he whispered, like saying her name too loudly might break the spell. She didn't take her eyes off the scope. "Spot for me," she said. Her voice startled him more than the gunfire ever could have. It wasn't panicked, it wasn't loud, it was steady, grounded, a voice that expected to be obeyed. "Sector 2, she added. Mike swallowed, then raised his binoculars. Training kicked in. 3 moving near the fuel drums, he said. His voice shook, then steadied. Left to right. Got them. 3 shots, 3 bodies fell. Mike stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Maybe he was. More fighters surged into view, emboldened, desperate. Sarah shifted position slightly, using the table leg for stability, adjusting her angle without conscious thought. She felt the strain in her shoulder now, the heat of the barrel, the bruise that would bloom later. She welcomed it. Pain meant she was still present, still choosing. An RPG operator appeared on the roofline. Mike called it out faster now, sharper, 400 meters. She nodded once, a movement so small it was almost nothing. She exhaled, felt her heartbeat slow until the space between beats felt wide enough to step into. She fired. The rocket streaked harmlessly into the sky as its handler crumpled backward. Something changed in the Rangers then. It wasn't just relief, it was belief. They surged forward, returning fire with renewed purpose, feeding off the impossible calm at the center of the room. For 10 minutes, the mess hall became something else entirely. Not a place of panic, a place of resistance. Sarah lost track of time, lost track of everything except the next threat, the next breath, the next squeeze. She felt strangely detached, as if watching herself from a distance, aware that this version of her had been waiting patiently for a moment like this. She wondered briefly what it would cost her later. The thought didn't slow her down. A deep rumble rolled through the ground. Everyone froze. Miller's face drained of color. "VBIED," he screamed. The suicide truck burst through the gate, armored and unstoppable, roaring straight toward them. Bullets sparked uselessly off its plating. Distance vanished too quickly. There was nowhere to run, no angle to hide. Mike grabbed her arm. "We have to go." She shook him off, harder than she meant to. "Wind," she said. He stared at her, incredulous. "What?" "Call it," she snapped. He looked through his optics, hands trembling. Left to right, 10 miles an hour, gusting. The truck was close now, too close. The slit in the armor was barely visible, a cruel joke of a target. Sarah closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She didn't pray. She calculated. Speed, distance, wind, time. She opened her eyes and aimed not at the truck, but at empty space. She squeezed. The shot felt different, final. The truck swerved, then veered away. Silence followed like an aftershock. When Sarah finally lowered the rifle, the weight of what she'd done crashed into her all at once. Her hands began to shake again. The old softness returned, rushing back in like a tide. She leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted, suddenly just a woman in a torn dress with dust in her hair. Miller dropped to his knees in front of her, not in command now, but in humility. "I was wrong," he said, voice breaking. Sarah looked at him, eyes red, confused. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I made a mess." He laughed through tears. "You saved us." She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd finally stopped running from herself. And as the dust settled and the echoes faded, one truth lingered, heavy and undeniable. Strength doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it waits quietly until it's needed most. Why did the silence afterward feel heavier than the gunfire ever had? It crept in slowly, almost politely, as if unsure it was welcome. The alarms were still wailing somewhere outside, distant now. Smoke hung in the air like a held breath. Hot brass sizzled on the concrete floor. But inside the mess hall no one spoke. Sarah sat where she'd slid down against the wall, knees pulled slightly inward, the rifle resting across her lap like something borrowed. Her hands shook openly now. Not the violent tremor of fear, but the delayed reaction of a body realizing it was no longer required to be perfect. Mike knelt beside her, one hand still hovering near her arm, unsure if touching her would pull her back to him or push her farther away. He didn't recognize the woman who had just saved his life. That scared him more than the ambush ever could. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, on a dark smear where blood and dust mixed together. She felt suddenly exposed, stripped, as if everyone could see straight through the softer version of herself she'd worked so hard to build, and into the colder truth underneath. Sergeant Miller was still on his knees. The man who had filled doorways with his presence now looked smaller somehow, shoulders slumped, helmet discarded beside him. He hadn't moved since he spoke. His apology lingered in the air, unfinished, inadequate, but real. Rangers stood frozen around them, rifles lowered, expressions caught between awe and disbelief. These were men who had watched friends die, men who didn't hand out reverence easily, and yet none of them could look away from her. Sarah hated that. She hugged her arms closer to herself, suddenly conscious of the torn hem of her dress, of the grime streaking her skin. She felt out of place again, but in a different way now, not because she was weak. Because she was. The sound of boots finally broke the spell. A reaction force poured into the mess hall, weapons up, eyes sharp, sweeping corners that no longer held threats. The colonel entered last, his presence immediate and commanding, his uniform too clean for what had just happened. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded. No one answered at first. Miller stood slowly as if gravity had increased. He straightened, squared his shoulders, and pointed, not dramatically, not proudly, but simply. "At her," he said. The colonel followed the line of his finger. He saw a civilian woman sitting on the floor, clutching her husband's hand, eyes red-rimmed, posture small. He saw a rifle across her lap. He saw the aftermath through the windows, the lifeless vehicle, the quiet ridge. "Who is she?" the colonel asked. Mike opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't know how to answer, not anymore. Miller spoke instead. "Her name is Sarah Vance, sir, and she just saved this platoon." The colonel studied her for a long moment, not suspiciously, curiously, like a man realizing the map he trusted was wrong. Sarah finally looked up. For a second, she thought she might say something foolish, apologize again, try to shrink back into something more comfortable for everyone else. Instead, she said nothing. And that silence, steady, unflinching, seemed to say more than words ever could. The debrief came later, after medics had moved through, after bodies were counted, after the valley returned to its tense, watchful quiet. Sarah wasn't invited into the room where officers spoke in clipped sentences and acronyms. She was escorted to a smaller space nearby, a chair, a bottle of water she forgot to drink. Her adrenaline faded in waves, leaving behind a hollow ache. She felt older, not wiser, just heavier, like something inside her had shifted permanently, settling into a place it couldn't be moved from again. Mike sat across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. "I didn't know," he said finally. She nodded. "I didn't tell you." "Why?" His voice wasn't accusing, just tired. She thought about it, really thought. "Because I wanted to be someone else," she said. "Because that part of me scared people, and I was tired of being seen as something dangerous." He looked at her then, not like a soldier, not like a husband trying to reconcile facts, but like a man realizing he had loved only part of the truth. "You scared me today," he admitted. Her throat tightened. "I scared myself." That was the part no one else would understand. Not fully. That the calm she'd felt during the fight, the clarity, had been terrifying in its own way, because it had been effortless, natural, like stepping back into a skin she'd never truly shed. She didn't know what that meant for the life they'd built. The colonel came to see her before sunset. He didn't bring ceremony with him. No entourage. Just a quiet presence and a look that suggested he'd been thinking hard. "I won't put your name in any official report," he said after a moment. "Not unless you ask me to." She looked up surprised. "You're a civilian," he continued, "and the system doesn't know what to do with civilians who don't fit the story." She almost laughed. He studied her carefully. "But know this," he added. "What you did today mattered, not because of how many people you stopped, but because you acted when everyone else believed you couldn't. He stood to leave, then paused. If you ever decide you want that part of your life back formally, there are doors that would open. Sarah watched him go. She didn't answer. That evening, the platoon formed a line without being told to. A corridor of dust-stained uniforms stretching toward the waiting helicopter. Someone handed her a bag. Someone else carried another. No jokes, no commentary. Just quiet acknowledgement. Miller stopped her at the ramp. He pulled a patch from his shoulder, the Ranger tab, and pressed it into her palm. "You earned this," he said simply. She tried to refuse. He shook his head. "For the rest of your life," he said, voice rough, "don't let anyone tell you you're weak." Her eyes burned. She closed her fingers around the patch like it might anchor her to the ground. As the helicopter lifted off, the base shrank beneath her. The valley stretched out, indifferent, ancient. She felt suspended between worlds, between who she had been and who she could no longer pretend not to be. Mike sat beside her, silent, his hand finding hers. Neither of them knew what came next. But for the first time, Sarah wasn't running from the question. Because some truths don't announce themselves loudly. They reveal themselves when everything else falls away. And once seen, they can't be unseen. What happens when the world goes back to normal, but you do? The helicopter's rotors faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt unnatural after the violence of the day. Sarah stood alone on the small airstrip hours later, back where the visit had begun, the sun low and bleeding orange across the horizon. The base was quieter now, not peaceful, just holding itself together the way damaged things do. She hugged herself against the cooling air. The patch was still in her pocket. It felt heavier than it should have. Mike was pulled away almost immediately after they landed. Another briefing, another perimeter check, another reminder that the war didn't pause just because she was leaving. She watched him go without protest, realizing with a dull ache that something essential had shifted between them. Not broken. Changed. Back in the temporary quarters assigned to her, Sarah sat on the edge of a narrow cot, hands folded in her lap. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and dust. A single light flickered overhead. She could still hear echoes if she let herself, gunfire, shouting, the crack of the rifle, but she forced them away. She learned long ago that if you didn't control the memories, they would control you. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it wasn't rest. It was fragments, the ridge, the truck, her father's voice counting heartbeats. She woke before dawn, breath shallow, eyes already open, staring at the ceiling like it might offer answers. She wondered if this was how it started. The part no one warned you about. In the morning, she walked the base one last time. Rangers passed her now and nodded. Some stopped her awkwardly, unsure how to speak to her. Gratitude sat heavy in their expressions, mixed with something else, distance maybe, as if they weren't sure where to place her anymore. Neither was she. Miller approached near the motor pool. He didn't look like the man from the day before. He looked tired, human. "Didn't sleep, did you?" he asked. She shook her head. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that tracks." They stood there for a moment, listening to engines and distant radio chatter. "I was wrong about you," he said. "Not just yesterday, about the kind of strength that matters." Sarah studied him. "You weren't wrong about the danger," she said. "I just wasn't what you thought it was." He nodded slowly. "That might be worse." She almost smiled. The flight out came faster than she expected. Paperwork, signatures, a quiet efficiency designed to move people through before anyone thought too hard about what had happened. As the transport plane lifted, the valley disappeared beneath the clouds. Sarah felt an unexpected grief twist in her chest, not for the place, but for the clarity she'd found there, for the simplicity of knowing exactly what was required of her. Back home, normal life rushed to meet her. Too fast. The airport was bright and loud and full of people complaining about delays, coffee shops, laughter. She moved through it all like a ghost, aware of how fragile it all suddenly seemed, how thin the walls were between comfort and chaos. At home, she unpacked slowly. The dress went into the wash, stained beyond saving. Her purse sat untouched. The patch stayed in her pocket. Mike returned weeks later. They didn't talk about it right away. They cooked dinner. They slept in the same bed. They laughed at the wrong moments and avoided eye contact at the right ones. Love was still there, but it was navigating unfamiliar terrain. One night, months later, she woke to the sound of him packing. "I keep thinking about that moment," he said when she asked. "The second you picked up that rifle." She waited. "I didn't know if I was watching my wife," he continued, voice thick, "or someone I didn't know at all." She sat up, pulling the covers around herself. "Both," she said gently. He exhaled, long and shaky. "Does that part of you ever go away?" She thought about it. "No," she said, "but it doesn't have to be in control." That answer seemed to settle something in him. Time moved on. The story followed her anyway. Whispers, retellings, a friend of a friend who knew a guy who'd been there. She never corrected them, never claimed anything. The truth didn't belong to the version people wanted to hear. What stayed with her wasn't the shots she'd taken. It was the moment before. The decision. The acceptance that she could act without needing permission. That realization changed the way she walked through the world. She stood a little straighter, spoke a little less, listened more. She started hiking again, alone, long distances, letting the quiet work through her. Sometimes she brought a rifle, sometimes she didn't. She wasn't trying to become someone new. She was integrating someone old. One afternoon, she took the patch from her pocket and placed it in a small wooden box, not hidden, not displayed, just acknowledged. She understood now that redemption didn't always mean erasing who you were. Sometimes it meant finally allowing all of it to exist. Strength and softness, fear and resolve. The world wanted simple stories. Sarah had learned to live with something truer. Because the bravest thing she'd done wasn't pulling the trigger. It was refusing to pretend that part of her didn't exist. And in that quiet honesty, she found something steadier than pride. She found peace. What do you do when the silence finally gives you time to ask the questions you avoided in the fight? Sarah noticed the change in herself one ordinary morning, months after everything was supposed to be over. It wasn't dramatic. No flashbacks, no sudden fear, just a moment in the kitchen, sunlight cutting across the counter, the kettle screaming because she'd forgotten to turn it off. She stood there, hand frozen midair, listening to the sound stretch too long. In the valley, a sound like that would have meant something, a warning, a shift. Her heart didn't race. That was the strange part. It slowed instead. She turned off the stove, sat down, and realized she had been holding herself at readiness without knowing it, like a door left half open all the time. She wondered if it would ever close. Mike was back on rotation stateside then. Home, but not settled. He slept lightly, always aware of exits. They moved around each other with care, learning new contours of the same shared space. Love hadn't vanished, but it had matured into something quieter, more deliberate. Some nights they talked. Most nights they didn't. The patch stayed in its box. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. Knowing where it was felt sufficient, like knowing the location of a scar without tracing it. People asked questions sometimes, indirect ones. Did it scare you? Could you ever do something like that again? How did it feel? She answered politely, carefully, never fully. Because the truth wasn't cinematic. The truth was that the fear hadn't been the worst part. The worst part was how right it had felt. That frightened her more than bullets ever could. She started volunteering at a local outdoor range, not teaching, not shooting competitively. Just helping, logging equipment, talking to people who were new, unsure, trying to understand why they wanted to learn in the first place. She recognized that look. One afternoon, a teenage girl struggled to steady a rifle, frustration written all over her face. Her father hovered, correcting too loudly, too often. Sarah watched for a while before stepping in. "May I?" she asked gently. The girl nodded. Sarah didn't talk about technique right away. She talked about breathing, about letting the noise exist without reacting to it, about how control didn't mean force, it meant timing. The girl's shoulders relaxed, her shots improved. When she smiled afterward, it wasn't pride that hit Sarah. It was recognition. Driving home, Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't known was there. Purpose didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived disguised as patience. Mike noticed the change before she did. "You're lighter," he said one night, sitting on the porch as dusk settled around them. She considered that. "I think I stopped fighting myself," she replied. He nodded, understanding more than she expected. The offer came quietly. Not through official channels, not with pressure. A former colonel, retired now, called under the guise of checking in, asked how she was adjusting, asked if she'd ever considered consulting, training, advising. "You wouldn't be on the front lines," he said. "You'd be helping others survive theirs." She didn't answer right away. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Mike's steady breathing beside her. She thought about the valley, about the ridge, about the moment she'd chosen to act without knowing the cost. She thought about the girl at the range. She thought about her father, long gone now, and the lessons he'd never framed as legacy, only as responsibility. In the morning she said yes. The work was different from what people imagined. No weapons most days, no uniforms, just rooms filled with men and women learning how to trust themselves again, learning restraint, awareness, judgment. Sarah didn't lead with her story. She led with listening. When she spoke, it was measured, precise. She didn't glorify anything. She talked about consequences, about the weight of decisions that don't leave you when the noise stops. They respected her because she never asked them to admire her. They trusted her because she didn't pretend it was easy. Mike struggled at first, not with jealousy, with fear. "I don't want to lose you to that world," he admitted one evening. She took his hand. "You won't," she said. "I'm not going back. I'm moving forward with everything I am." That distinction mattered. Years passed. The story faded into something quieter, a footnote, a rumor. Sarah preferred it that way. She built a life that made room for all of her, not just the parts that fit comfortably into conversation. One autumn morning, she received a letter. No return address, just a name she didn't recognize. Inside, a single page. "I was there. I was one of them. I never said thank you because I didn't know how to speak to someone who changed my understanding of strength. You didn't save me by pulling the trigger. You saved me by showing me that restraint and resolve can exist in the same body. I carry that with me." Sarah read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the box with the patch. She sat for a long time afterward, watching leaves fall outside the window, each one letting go when it was ready, not before, not after. She finally understood something she'd been circling for years. Redemption wasn't about balance. It was about acceptance. About standing still long enough to let every version of yourself take its place without apology. Sarah didn't need medals. She didn't need stories told in whispers. She had learned to live with her truth in the open air. And that, she realized, was the hardest mission of all. Because dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. Sometimes it simply chooses to act. And then chooses, just as deliberately, To live. What remains when the story stops being told, but the meaning keeps breathing. Sarah didn't mark anniversaries anymore. Not the day of the ambush, not the flight home, not even the first time she realized she could move through a crowded room without scanning for exits. Dates had once mattered because they gave pain a container. Now, she let time move the way it wanted to, forward, uneven, honest. The morning she finally understood this, she was alone in the mountains again. The trail was familiar, pine and stone, thin air that forced every breath to be intentional. She moved steadily, boots crunching against gravel, a light pack on her shoulders. No weapon this time, just water, a notebook, and the quiet. She stopped at a ridge overlook, just as the sun broke free of the clouds. The valley below looked peaceful, deceptively so, it always had. She sat on a flat rock, letting the warmth touch her face, and thought about how many versions of herself had existed over the years. The child who learned patience before play, the young woman who hid sharp edges behind soft smiles, the wife who only wanted her husband safe, the figure in a torn dress who had made a decision that could not be undone. None of them felt separate anymore. That was new. For a long time she'd believed healing meant choosing which version of herself deserved to survive, silencing the others. But standing there now, she realized the truth was quieter and harder. Healing meant letting them all speak. She pulled out the notebook and opened to a blank page. She didn't write about the ambush, not directly. She wrote about breath, about waiting, about how strength often arrived disguised as stillness, about how fear wasn't a flaw, it was information. She wrote until the sun climbed higher. When she returned home, Mike was in the garage, working on something that didn't need fixing. He looked up when she came in, smiled without effort. The kind of smile that came from knowing, not wondering. "You good?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah, I am." They learned not to demand more than that. Their life wasn't extraordinary from the outside. Work, friends, quiet evenings, shared routines, but beneath it ran a depth that didn't need explanation. They had seen each other at edges most people never reached and chosen to stay. Sometimes, late at night, Mike would ask questions he hadn't known how to ask before. Not about the shooting, about the weight of decisions, about how to live with certainty without becoming rigid, about when to act and when to wait. Sarah answered when she could. When she couldn't, she said so. That honesty mattered more than certainty. Years later, she stood in a small room filled with young recruits, men and women early in their careers, faces still unmarked by consequence. She wasn't there to impress them. She never was. She spoke softly. She told them that the hardest moments wouldn't announce themselves with noise or chaos. They would arrive quietly, wrapped in seconds where no one else could decide for them. She told them that courage wasn't loud, and that restraint was not weakness. No one clapped when she finished. They didn't need to. Afterward, a young woman approached her, nervous, determined, familiar. "How do you know when you're ready?" she asked. Sarah considered the question for a long time. "You don't," she said finally. "You just decide to be honest in the moment you're given." The woman nodded, absorbing that, and walked away a little straighter than she'd arrived. That night, Sarah opened the wooden box. Inside were only a few things now: the patch, the letter, the folded pages of a life she no longer needed to hide. She touched each one, not with longing, not with pride, but with gratitude. Because they had taught her something no single moment ever could. That strength didn't come from proving yourself to others. It came from answering yourself truthfully when it mattered most. The world would never fully know her story. And that was fine. Stories, she'd learned, were often shaped by what people needed to believe. Meaning lived somewhere else, in the choices that followed, in the way you carried yourself when no one was watching. Sarah closed the box and placed it back on the shelf. Outside, the evening settled gently over the land. Tomorrow would come, ordinary, demanding, full of small decisions that still mattered. She would meet it as she always did now, without performance, without apology, without pretending any part of herself didn't exist. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't explain. It doesn't seek permission or recognition. Sometimes dignity simply acts, and then has the courage to live quietly with what it's done.